Have you ever felt your heart stop while your body was still fighting to breathe? I have. I felt mine turn to ice in the middle of a blizzard, shattered by a single word from the man who was supposed to be my soul's keeper. They say when an alpha king rejects his mate, the world goes quiet. They're wrong. The world doesn't go quiet. It screams. I was 8 months pregnant, heavy with the weight of 2 lives I hadn't even named yet, when I was cast out of the Nightshade Palace like a common traitor. I remember the biting cold of the snow, but it was nothing compared to the cold in Daelon's eyes. He stood on his throne of gold and shadow, watching as they stripped the royal crest from my skin. I waited for him to stop them. I waited for the bond to flare, for his wolf to roar in my defense. But silence is a weapon, and that day, Daelon used it to kill me. He didn't just exile a Luna, he discarded a bloodline. My name is Seraphine Thornwilde, and I was the Queen of Nightshade, until they decided a tainted mate was a liability. They threw me out during labor, left me to bleed into the frozen earth of the Shadowfen, and waited for the crows to finish what the king started. They called me a stain on their lineage. They were wrong. This is the story of how I died in the snow and rose in the shadows, how I birthed 2 miracles in a hollowed-out tree while the moon looked on in silence. This is the story of how the king who threw us away realized too late that he hadn't cast out a traitor. He had exiled the only thing keeping his kingdom alive. But before we begin, make sure to subscribe and hit that like button if you believe in a mother's revenge. And comment down below, where in the world are you watching from today? Now, let me take you back to the morning the sun stopped rising. To the high court of Nightshade, where the man I loved told me I was nothing. The golden light of the high court felt like a mockery. It was a room designed to radiate justice, with its vaulted ceilings and white marble floors, but today it felt like a gilded cage. I stood at the center of the mosaic floor, my feet aching and my swollen belly feeling heavier than ever. At 8 months pregnant, every breath was a chore, yet the air in the room was so thick with the scent of betrayal that I felt I was suffocating. On the dais sat Alpha King Daelon. His face, once the only place I found peace, was a mask of granite. To his right stood Chancellor Vex, clutching a scroll with the white-knuckled grip of a man who had finally trapped his prey. And then there was Isolde. She stood just a step behind Daelon, her head bowed, a single perfect tear tracking down her cheek. The evidence is irrefutable, my king. Vex's voice rang out, echoing against the marble. He held up a handful of letters, forged, every single one of them, and a grainy projection of a woman who looked like me entering a guard's quarters at midnight. High treason, adultery, a direct violation of the Royal Lineage Act. Under Law 402, the penalty for a Luna who brings a bastard seed into the Nightshade bloodline is absolute, total exile and the severance of the soul. I tried to speak, but my voice was a dry rasp. Daelon, please, you know me. You know I haven't left the East Wing in months. I can barely walk, let alone— Silence! Vex barked. Isolde let out a soft, theatrical sob. Oh, Sarah, how could you? We all wanted to believe in you, but the moon doesn't lie. Look at the king. Can you not see the shame you've brought him? I ignored her. I looked only at Daelon. I needed him to see me. I needed the bond, that invisible golden thread that connected our spirits, to tell him the truth. I took a step forward, my hand trembling as I reached toward him. I just needed to touch him. If I could touch his hand, he would feel the pulse of his own children beneath my skin. Daelon, I whispered. my fingers inches from the hem of his royal cloak. He didn't look down. He didn't flinch. He simply pulled his hand away, tucking it beneath the heavy fur of his mantle, as if my very presence were a contagion. The rejection of that small movement hurt more than a physical blow. Seraphine Thornwilde, Daelon finally spoke. His voice was deep, resonant, and utterly devoid of the warmth that used to whisper my name in the dark. You have been found wanting by the laws of this pack and the council of my court. I will not have a kingdom built on a lie, nor will I provide a throne for a child that does not carry my blood. "They are yours!" I screamed. The force of it sent a sharp, stabbing pain through my abdomen. I buckled, clutching my stomach. "Daelon, look at me!" He stood up, towering over the room. The air grew cold as he summoned the Alpha's authority, the power to break what the moon goddess had joined. I, Daelon Nightshade, Alpha King of the Nightshade Kingdom, hereby reject you, Seraphine Thornwilde, as my mate and my Luna. I strip you of your name. I strip you of your rank. I cast you out from the protection of my walls and the warmth of my fire. The world didn't just go quiet. It snapped. The bond didn't just break. It exploded inside my chest. It felt like a hot iron rod being driven through my heart and twisted until the fibres of my soul began to unravel. I collapsed to my knees, a guttural, inhuman sound tearing from my throat. It wasn't just emotional pain, it was physical mutilation. In that same moment, a violent, jagged contraction ripped through my middle. My body, already shattered by the bond snap, began to turn on itself. Stress and agony had signalled my womb that the world was no longer safe. The labour was starting, and it was angry. "Get her out of my sight," Daelon commanded, turning his back on me. Isolde's face shifted for a fraction of a second, the sorrow vanishing to reveal a jagged, predatory smile. Vex nodded to the guards. They didn't use a carriage. They didn't even give me a coat. Two enforcers grabbed me by the arms, dragging my dead weight across the cold marble I had once walked as a queen. My toes dragged along the floor, leaving faint scuff marks that would be polished away by morning. They hauled me through the back gates, far from the eyes of the public, and drove me to the very edge of the Shadowfen, the cursed border where the kingdom's protection ended. The iron gates groaned open. Beyond lay nothing but the biting wind and a white abyss of snow. "King's orders," one of the guards muttered, his face hidden behind a helmet. With a brutal shove, he threw me forward. I fell hard, my hand sinking into the freezing slush. The impact sent another wave of labour through me, so intense I couldn't even scream. I lay there face down in the mud and ice as the heavy iron gates of Nightshade slammed shut. The bolt slid home with a final metallic thud. I was 8 months pregnant, in active labour, and the man I loved had just tossed me into a graveyard. The cold was not a blanket, it was a blade. It sliced through my thin shift, biting into my skin until the shivering stopped and a terrifying numbness took its place. I dragged myself forward on my elbows, each movement a war against the gravity of my own body and the slick, treacherous mud. Behind me, the towering walls of Nightshade were a silhouette of the life I had lost. Ahead, the Shadowfen loomed, a twisted cathedral of gnarled trees and ancient, hungry secrets. Another contraction gripped me, a white-hot iron twisting in my gut, and this time a ragged sob escaped my lips. I couldn't die here, not because I feared the dark, but because the two small hearts beating frantically against my own deserved a chance to see the sun. I found refuge in the hollow of a massive rotted oak. Its trunk was a blackened shell, but it offered a reprieve from the wind that sought to skin me alive. I collapsed into the damp leaf mould and ancient dust, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. My vision was beginning to fray at the edges, the world dissolving into grey shadows. I felt the life force leaking out of me, my wolf suppressed by the agony of the broken bond and the trauma of the premature labour. I was fading, drifting into a sleep that I knew had no morning. "Stay with me, little wolf." The voice was gravel and honey, cutting through the fog of my dying mind. I felt hands, rough, calloused, but incredibly gentle, lifting my head. A woman's face blurred into view, her eyes sharp and filled with a fierce emerald light. Beside her stood a man who radiated a power so dense it made the air hum. He was scarred, his scent a mix of pine needles and lightning. "She's in transition, Rowan," the woman whispered, her hands moving over my belly with practiced precision. "The babies are coming now. If we try to move her, we lose all three." "Then do it here, Mavis," the man replied, his voice a low rumble that seemed to anchor me to the earth. He stepped to the mouth of the hollow, his shadow long and protective against the raging blizzard. "I'll hold the perimeter. Nothing gets through tonight." The hours that followed were a blur of red pain and icy sweat. Mavis was a ghost of comfort in the dark, her voice a steady tether as she guided me through the impossible. The bond snap had left a hole in my soul that made every push feel like I was tearing myself apart. I screamed until my throat was raw, my fingers clawing into the rotted wood of the tree as the first life forced its way into the world. A sharp, piercing cry broke the howling of the wind. Then, barely a minute later, a second cry joined the first. In that instant, the world stopped breathing. The wind, which had been shrieking like a banshee, died into a sudden, eerie silence. The thick, suffocating clouds above the Shadowfen parted as if sliced by a divine hand, revealing a moon so large and luminous it turned the snow to liquid silver. "Look, Sarah," Mavis whispered, her voice trembling with an emotion I couldn't yet name. She leaned down, placing two small, warm bundles against my chest. I looked down, my heart stuttering in my chest. I expected the dark hair of the Thornwilde line or the chestnut brown of my own. Instead, I saw tufts of hair as white as the moon itself. But it was when they opened their eyes that the world truly changed. They didn't have the cloudy blue of newborns. They peered up at me with eyes of pure molten silver, glowing with a regal, ancient light that I had only ever seen in the portraits of the first kings. Rowan turned from the entrance, his breath catching in his throat. The rogue Alpha, a man who looked like he had defied gods and kings alike, slowly sank to one knee on the frozen ground. His gaze was fixed on the infants in my arms, his expression one of profound awe. "By the mother," he breathed, his voice barely a whisper. The silver eyes, the royal mark of the Nightshade ancestors. Daelon didn't just exile a mate. He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of hope in the wreckage of my life. "He exiled his masters," Rowan said, his voice gaining strength. "These aren't bastards, Seraphine. They are the moon's chosen royalty, and the world is going to tremble when they claim what is theirs." I pulled my children closer, their warmth the only thing keeping the frost from my heart. The king had thrown us out to die, believing he had purged his bloodline of a stain. He didn't know that in the heart of the cursed forest the moon had just crowned his successors. As the twins' eyes flashed with a power that hummed in my own veins, I knew the woman who had crawled into this tree was dead. In her place a mother was rising, and she would have her vengeance. I pulled my children closer, their warmth the only thing keeping the frost from my heart. The king had thrown us out to die, believing he had purged his bloodline of a stain. He didn't know that in the heart of the cursed forest, the moon had just crowned his successors. As the twins' eyes flashed with a power that hummed in my own veins, I knew the woman who had crawled into this tree was dead. In her place, a mother was rising, and she would have her vengeance. The journey from that hollowed tree to the hidden heart of the Shadowfen was a blur of silver moonlight and Rowan's steady strength. He carried me when my legs failed, while Mavis held the twins as if they were made of spun glass. We passed through a wall of mist so thick it felt like walking through a dream, a barrier of ancient magic that hummed against my skin, sensing the royal blood in the infant's veins. On the other side lay Luna's Rest, a valley where the grass remained green despite the winter and the air tasted of cedar and safety. It was a sanctuary built from the wreckage of the wolf world, a collection of stone cottages and sturdy longhouses filled with those the great packs had deemed defective. There were omegas with scarred backs, elderly wolves who had been abandoned by their kin, and warriors who had refused to follow cruel orders. Here, I wasn't a queen or a traitor. I was simply Sarah. But as I looked at the humble peace of the valley, a cold fire began to settle in my chest. The sweet Omega, who had spent her days arranging flowers in the Nightshade Palace and begging for Daelon's affection, was gone, buried under the snow at the border. The months that followed were a grueling rebirth. While the sun tracked across the sky, I was no longer content to sit by the hearth. Even as I nursed Kieran and Lysandra, their silver eyes watching me with an intelligence that far outstripped their age, my lap was draped not with embroidery, but with parchment maps of the Nightshade Kingdom. I studied the patrol routes I had once memorized for gala invitations, now marking them as strategic choke points. I traced the mountain passes and the underground rivers, memorizing the veins of a land that had bled me out. "You're pushing yourself too hard, Sarah," Rowan said one evening, leaning against the doorframe of my cottage. He watched as I balanced a heavy training blade in one hand, while Kieran drifted into sleep against my breast. "I was pushed out of my home while in labour, Rowan," I replied, my voice like whetstone on steel. "There is no such thing as too hard anymore." Under Rowan's tutelage, I began to reclaim the strength the palace had tried to suppress. I learned to fight not just with claws, but with the cold, calculated precision of someone who has nothing left to lose. But the true change happened deep within my spirit. I remembered the way Daelon had used his alpha command to paralyze me in the High Court, the way his voice had forced my knees to hit the floor. I vowed that no man, king or rogue, would ever use his aura to bend my will again. One afternoon, during a sparring session, Rowan attempted to use a fraction of his alpha pressure to test my resolve. Usually, an alpha's command feels like an invisible weight, a crushing gravity that demands submission. But as his power surged towards me, something inside me snapped shut. A pulse of violet silver light radiated from my core, meeting his aura and simply dissolving it. The air went still. Rowan stumbled back, his eyes wide, his wolf retreating in sudden, inexplicable fear. I hadn't just resisted him. I had nullified him. I stood in the center of the ring, my breath steady, realizing that my trauma had birthed a terrifying gift. I could create a void where an alpha's... I was no longer a gear in their machine. I was the sand that would grind it to a halt. As I returned to my cottage to find my silver-eyed children waiting, I looked toward the southern mountains. Daelon thought he had left me in a graveyard, but I was building an army of shadows, and I was learning how to silence a king. 5 years passed, but time moves differently in a land without its soul. South of the mist, the Nightshade Kingdom was dying a slow, suffocating death. The once vibrant palace gardens, where I had spent my afternoons dreaming of a future with Daelon, were now a skeletal wasteland. The white roses had turned to black, shriveled stalks, and the ancient oaks had dropped their leaves as if in mourning, refusing to bloom for a throne built on a lie. The earth itself seemed to recognize that the true Luna had been bled into the snow, and it had withheld its bounty in protest. Daelon sat upon his throne, his eyes hollowed by half a decade of sleeplessness. Every time he closed them, he heard the echo of a scream that he had tried to bury in the frozen earth. He saw my face, pale and desperate, and felt the phantom agony of a bond he had severed but could never truly erase. Beside him, Isolde sat in the chair that was meant to be mine. She wore the silks of a queen and the jewels of the Nightshade lineage, but the crown sat heavy and awkward on her head. Despite her title as Acting Luna, her wolf was silent. The pack knew it. They felt the hollowness in her aura, the lack of the divine maternal warmth that was supposed to anchor the warrior's spirits. Without a true Luna to balance the alpha's fire, the pack was becoming brittle. The warriors were sluggish, their shifts agonizing and incomplete, and a creeping lethargy had settled over the once mighty Nightshade army. The tension in the throne room was thick enough to taste when a scout burst through the heavy oak doors, his chest heaving. He bypassed the councillors and the chancellor, falling to one knee before Daelon. His scent was sharp, with a mixture of terror and awe, a smell that finally broke Daelon's 1,000-yard stare. "Speak," Daelon commanded, his voice like the grinding of tectonic plates. "My king," the scout gasped, "I have returned from the northern fringes near the Shadowfen border. There are whispers. The rogue packs are no longer fighting amongst themselves. They are organized, and they are protecting something." Daelon leaned forward, his hands gripping the armrests of his throne so hard the wood groaned. "Rogues are scavengers. They don't organize. What could they possibly be guarding?" The scout swallowed hard, glancing nervously at the scowling Chancellor Vex before meeting the king's eyes. "A boy, sire. A child no older than 5. Our scouts watched from the ridge as a grizzly, crazed with the winter hunger, lunged at him. The boy didn't shift. He didn't even run. He just looked at the beast. The shadows themselves seemed to rise from the ground at his command, wrapping around the bear like iron chains. The animal, it didn't just stop. It whimpered and knelt before the child as if it had met its master. A collective gasp rippled through the court. Isolde's face turned a sickly shade of ash, her fingers clutching at her silk skirts, but it was the scout's next words that made Daelon's heart stop. "The boy's eyes, my king, they weren't brown or blue. When the shadows moved, his eyes glowed with a pure, piercing silver." The silence that followed was absolute. Silver eyes were the mythic mark of the Nightshade founders, a trait that hadn't manifested in 3 generations. Daelon felt a cold sweat break across his brow as the memory of my pregnant belly flashed before him. The belly he had called a vessel for bastards. "Impossible," Vex hissed, stepping forward to silence the scout. "It is a trick of the mist, a rogue hallucination." But Daelon was already standing, his alpha aura flaring with a sudden, violent intensity that knocked the nearby advisors back. The lethargy that had plagued him for 5 years was gone, replaced by a desperate, frantic need for the truth. "Prepare my vanguard," Daelon roared, his wolf finally howling in the back of his mind, a sound of recognition, and suppressed rage. I will not send scouts to chase ghost stories. I will see this shadow boy myself. If there is a child in that forest with silver eyes, I will know who he belongs to, even if I have to burn the Shadowfen to the ground to find him. As the king strode out of the hall, Isolde watched him go, her eyes wide with a terror she couldn't hide. She knew, as well as the dying gardens did, that the past wasn't buried. It was coming home, and it was bringing the shadows with it. As the king strode out of the hall, Isolde watched him go, her eyes wide with a terror she couldn't hide. She knew, as well as the dying gardens did, that the past wasn't buried. It was coming home, and it was bringing the shadows with it. The journey to the northern fringes felt like marching into the jaws of a ghost. The air grew thick and heavy, a white, unnatural mist rolling off the Shadowfen until the sun was nothing more than a pale, sickly coin in the sky. Daelon rode at the head of his elite vanguard, his face a mask of grim determination, flanked by Theron, his most loyal beta, and Draven, the ruthless enforcer who had once dragged me to the border. They were the finest warriors of the Nightshade Kingdom, yet as they crossed the threshold of the mist, the forest seemed to swallow their confidence whole. The silence was the first thing that began to grate on their nerves. No birds chirped, no insects buzzed. There was only the sound of their horses' hooves, muffled by the damp moss and the rhythmic clanking of their armour. Then the forest began to fight back. It started with Theron. One moment he was riding beside the king, and the next, a vine braided with silver wire and hidden beneath the fog snapped upward. It didn't pierce his skin, but it caught his stirrup with the force of a spring-loaded trap. Before he could roar a warning, he was yanked from his saddle and hoisted 10 feet into the air, dangling by his ankle like a common rabbit. "Beda!" Draven snarled, his hand flying to his sword, but as he lunged forward to cut his comrade down, the ground beneath his feet gave way. A hidden pit, filled not with spikes, but with a thick, viscous mud mixed with wolfsbane oil, swallowed him to the waist. The oil acted instantly, dulling his wolf and leaving him sputtering and stuck, his fearsome reputation sinking into the muck. Daelon pulled his mount to a halt, his golden eyes flashing with a mixture of fury and a growing, gnawing unease. "Show yourself!" he roared, his alpha command vibrating through the mist. Instead of an answer, a low whistle echoed from the trees. His horse, a beast trained for the chaos of war, suddenly reared as if stung by a hornet. Daelon leaped from the saddle just as the horse bolted into the fog, disappearing as if it had never existed. He stood alone in a small circular clearing, the mist swirling around his boots like a living thing. The air here felt different. It was charged, electric, and strangely devoid of the alpha pressure he usually used to dominate his surroundings. A soft crunch of boots on frost-covered leaves sounded from behind him. Daelon spun around, his claws extending, his wolf, Fenris, pacing frantically at the edge of his consciousness. Fenris was howling, but it wasn't a howl of war. It was a confused, agonizing sound of longing. A figure emerged from the white veil. She didn't look like the broken girl he had thrown into the slush 5 years ago. This woman was a vision of lethal grace, clad in dark, supple leather armor that clung to a body forged by hardship and survival. Her hair, once soft and unruly, was braided back with silver rings, and her skin, though pale, glowed with a vitality that his dying kingdom hadn't seen in years. She moved with the silent confidence of a predator who owned the woods. But it was her eyes that stopped his heart. They were hard, cold, and shimmering with a violet-silver light that mirrored the ancient power of the forest. Before Daelon could utter her name, she moved. She was a blur of motion, closing the distance between them with a speed that defied logic. A spear, its tip forged from obsidian and dipped in lunar essence, levelled itself at his throat, the sharp point resting just beneath his Adam's apple. "Sarah," he breathed, his voice cracking. The name felt like a prayer and a confession all at once. Fenris surged forward in his mind, scratching at the surface, desperate to shift, to touch, to howl his apology to the mate he thought he had lost. But as Daelon tried to reach for that connection, he felt nothing but a cold, empty void. His power, his command, his very wolf seemed to hit a wall and vanish. Sarah didn't flinch. She didn't look at him with the love that used to be his oxygen. She looked at him like he was a plague. "That name died in the snow 5 years ago, King Daelon," she said, her voice like ice grinding against stone. The tip of the spear nipped his skin, drawing a single tiny bead of crimson blood. "You're trespassing on ground that remembers your cruelty. Give me one reason why I shouldn't let the forest finish what you started." Sarah didn't flinch. She didn't look at him with the love that used to be his oxygen. She looked at him like he was a plague. "That name died in the snow 5 years ago, King Daelon," she said, her voice like ice grinding against stone. The tip of the spear nipped his skin, drawing a single tiny bead of crimson blood. "You're trespassing on ground that remembers your cruelty. Give me one reason why I shouldn't let the forest finish what you started." She didn't kill him, but the mercy she showed felt worse than an execution. Daelon was stripped of his weapons and led, like a common captive, through the shimmering veil of the sanctuary. He walked with his head down, his senses reeling from the sheer impossibility of the place. The air here was warm, smelling of blooming jasmine and wood smoke, a jarring contrast to the skeletal, dying woods he had left behind. He was brought to a stone lodge at the centre of the valley, a place that radiated a quiet, domestic peace that felt like a slap to his face. Inside the lodge, the fire crackled in the hearth, casting long, dancing shadows against the walls. Sarah stood by the window, her back to him, her posture as rigid as a glacier. Daelon took a tentative step forward, his voice trembling with a desperation that would have horrified his counsel. "Sarah, I was a fool. They showed me records, letters. They told me the child wasn't mine. I thought I was protecting the crown. But every night since that day has been a torment. I have looked for you in every shadow. Please, let me make this right." Sarah turned, and the sheer force of her gaze stopped the breath in his lungs. She didn't scream. Her voice was a low, lethal hum. "Make it right. You want to talk about time, Daelon? Let's talk about the wait of 5 years. You missed the first night in the forest when the fever nearly took them because I had no blankets to keep them warm. You missed the first time Kieran's hand curled around my finger and the first time Lysandra laughed at the sound of the rain. You weren't there when they took their first steps on frozen ground while I prayed the rogue patrols wouldn't find us." She took a step toward him, her eyes flashing silver. "I spent nights clawing at the dirt to find roots to eat so my milk wouldn't dry up. I watched the moon rise and fall 1,000 times, waiting for the mate bond to spark, waiting for the man who promised to protect me to realize he had thrown away his soul. You didn't just miss milestones, Daelon. You missed the moment I stopped being yours." Daelon sank onto a wooden bench, his face buried in his hands. The weight of her words felt like physical blows, bruising his spirit in ways no battle ever could. "I didn't know," he choked out. "I thought you were dead. You hoped I was dead," she corrected him, because a dead woman can't bear witness to a king's cowardice. The heavy oak door creaked open, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. Two small figures stood in the threshold, silhouetted against the twilight. Daelon froze as the boy stepped into the firelight. He was a miniature mirror of the king. The same high cheekbones, the same stubborn set of the jaw, and the same thick, dark hair. But as the boy looked at Daelon, his shadow began to stretch across the floor, moving with a predatory intent of its own. With a flick of his wrist, the boy sent a ripple of darkness across the stones. The shadows coiled around Daelon's ankles like iron shackles, yanking his feet out from under him. The king hit the floor with a heavy thud, staring up in shock at the 5-year-old who had just effortlessly humbled him. "Who is this man, mother?" the boy asked, his voice calm but layered with a power that made the hearth fire flicker. Beside him, a girl with hair like spun moonlight stepped forward. She moved with a delicate, haunting grace that Daelon recognized instantly. It was the exact gait of his own mother, the queen who had died long before Sarah had ever come to court. She looked down at Daelon, her silver eyes wide and inquisitive, yet filled with an ancient wisdom that felt divine. Daelon looked from the boy to the girl, and then back to Sarah. The truth hit him with the force of a tidal wave, drowning his pride. These weren't just children. They were the absolute manifestation of his bloodline, refined and perfected by the very woman he had cast aside. Kieran, the master of shadows, and Lysandra, the image of royal grace. He looked at the boy who had his face and the girl who had his mother's soul, and for the first time in his life, Alpha King Daelon Nightshade felt small. He realized the magnitude of the catastrophe he had authored. He hadn't just lost a mate, he had spent 5 years presiding over a dying kingdom while the future of the world was growing in the shadows, taught to hate him by the only woman he had ever truly loved. He stayed on the floor, pinned by his son's shadows, knowing that no apology in any language could ever bridge the canyon he had dug between them. He stayed on the floor, pinned by his son's shadows, knowing that no apology in any language could ever bridge the canyon he had dug between them. The fire popped, a spark jumping onto the hearth, and the silence in the room became a suffocating weight. Sarah gestured with a slight tilt of her chin, and Kieran retracted the shadows. The boy didn't do it out of obedience to a father, but out of respect for his mother. He and Lysandra retreated to the corner, their silver eyes never leaving the man who looked like a ghost of their future. "Send them out, Sarah," Daelon whispered, his voice thick with a grief that threatened to break his alpha composure. "Please, I need to speak to you." Sarah nodded to Mavis, who ushered the twins into the adjoining room. Once the door clicked shut, the air in the lodge seemed to sharpen. Daelon stood up slowly, his joints stiff, and looked at the woman he had once called his home. "The kingdom is dying, Sarah. The crops won't grow. The shifted forms of our warriors are becoming unstable, and the moon goddess has turned her face from us. I thought it was a curse, or a sickness of the land. But seeing you, seeing them, I realized the goddess didn't leave us. I threw the heart of the kingdom away." He stepped toward her, his hands open in a gesture of supplication. "Come back with me, not as a prisoner, but as the High Queen. I will kneel before you in front of the entire court. I will give you anything. Half the treasury, the heads of the councillors who voted against you. Just return. Save the people. Save the Nightshade name." Sarah let out a cold, sharp laugh that contained no humour. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated cynicism. "The Nightshade name? You think I care about your lineage? You think I care about the stone walls and the silk banners of a city that cheered while I was dragged through the mud? She stepped into his space, her violet silver eyes glowing with a terrifying intensity. I don't care if your kingdom turns to ash, Daelon. I don't care if your warriors forget how to howl and your gardens become a graveyard. My kingdom is right here. It's in the rogues you called trash, the Omegas you called weak, and the children you called bastards. They are my people too, Daelon argued, his desperation rising. They were your people, Sarah corrected, her finger poking his chest right over his heart, until you decided they weren't worth the breath of a king. You ask me to save your people. I am already saving the only ones who matter, the ones you threw away. Every person in this valley is here because someone like you decided they were a stain on a perfect bloodline. I am not a savior for your throne, Daelon. I am the refuge for your victims. Daelon's shoulders slumped, but his mind was racing, trying to reconcile the woman before him with the reports he had received for half a decade. Vex told me. He said his spies found you months after the exile. He told me you were living in the southern lands with a human lover. He said you had found happiness and that you laughed when he told you the kingdom was struggling. I believed him because it was easier than believing I had killed you. The air in the room suddenly turned electric. Sarah's face didn't change, but the glass jars on the mantel began to rattle. Vex said what? He said, you moved on. He told me you were pregnant by another man before you even left the palace gates. Daelon's eyes narrowed as the pieces of a 5-year-old puzzle began to click into a sickening formation. He told me he saw you with him, that you looked him in the eye and said, you never loved me. Sarah's silence was more damning than a scream. The realization hit Daelon like a physical blow to the gut. The forged letters, the lover in the guards' quarters, the reports of her happy life elsewhere. It wasn't just a mistake. It was a calculated, surgical strike, designed to ensure he would never go looking for his mate. Vex hadn't just advised the king. He had puppet-mastered a genocide of the king's own heart. A low, guttural growl started deep in Daelon's chest, a sound so primal it made the floorboards vibrate. His wolf Fenris was no longer howling in grief. He was sharpening his teeth. The betrayal of the bond was one thing, but the systematic lie that had kept him from his children and his mate for 5 years was a sin that demanded blood. He lied to me, Daelon whispered, his voice vibrating with a lethal, quiet rage. He looked at Sarah, seeing the scars on her hands and the hardness in her eyes that Vex's lies had caused. He kept me from them. He kept me from you. Daelon's aura flared, not in an attempt to dominate Sarah, but as a promise of the violence to come. The Alpha King was back, but he wasn't looking for his crown. He was looking for a throat to tear out. I will kill him, Daelon vowed, his eyes shifting to a predatory gold. I will burn every lie he ever told until there is nothing left of him but a memory of pain. No one touches what is mine and lives to boast of it. Sarah watched him, her expression unreadable. For the first time she saw the spark of the man she had once loved, but it was wrapped in a darkness she didn't yet trust. Vex is a symptom, Daelon, she said softly. The system you built is the disease. You want blood? Fine. But don't think for a second that killing one man earns you a place at my table. Sarah watched him, her expression unreadable. For the first time, she saw the spark of the man she had once loved. But it was wrapped in a darkness she didn't yet trust. Vex is a symptom, Daelon, she said softly. The system you built is the disease. You want blood? Fine. But don't think for a second that killing one man earns you a place at my table. While the embers of justice began to glow in the heart of the sanctuary 60 miles south, the air in the Nightshade Palace had turned stagnant and foul. Chancellor Vex stood by the high-arched windows of the King's Solar, his fingers drumming a rhythmic, anxious beat against the stone. Daelon had been gone too long. The king was supposed to investigate a rumour and return within 2 days. It had now been 4. Every hour that passed without the king's return was a crack in the foundation of the lies Vex had spent 5 years cementing. Behind him, the door creaked open, and Isolde drifted into the room. She was no longer the weeping victim she played in public. Her face was drawn, her eyes glittering with a desperate, frantic edge. She looked at the empty throne, then at Vex. "He found her, didn't he?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "The scouts say the mist in the north didn't just swallow him, it welcomed him. If he sees her face, Vex, if he sees those children—" "Silence," Vex hissed, turning to glare at her. "He saw what I told him to see 5 years ago. He saw a traitor. If he finds a ghost in the woods, we will simply make sure that ghost finally rests." "You don't understand," Isolde countered, stepping toward a low table set with a silver bowl and a collection of dark glass vials. "The bond is a stubborn thing. It doesn't die just because you bury it. I need to know. I need to see what he sees." She didn't wait for his permission. Isolde reached into her robes and pulled out a small cloth, stained with a brown, dried crust, a piece of the bandage from Daelon's recent training injury. She dropped the cloth into the silver bowl and poured a thick, pungent liquid over it. As she chanted under her breath, a dark, oily smoke began to rise, coiling into the air like a serpent. The smoke didn't dissipate. It formed a window of shimmering black. In the reflection, they didn't see a king in mourning. They saw Daelon standing in a lodge filled with warmth, his eyes fixed on a woman who looked like a goddess of the woods, and then the vision shifted to the corner of the room, showing 2 small children with eyes that shone like molten silver. Isolde let out a strangled cry, her hand flying to her throat. The silver eyes, they're real. They're alive. "Vex, he knows! He knows everything." Vex's face didn't crumble. It hardened into a mask of pure, lethal malice. The time for subtle manipulation had ended. If the truth reached the palace, the pack would tear them both apart before the sun set. He turned toward the door, his voice dropping to a cold, hollow command. "Then we ensure that no one leaves that forest alive. Not the king, not the girl, and certainly not the miracles she's hiding." "How?" Isolde asked, her voice shaking. "Daelon has his elite guard, and if she has the rogues are flesh and blood," Vex replied, a jagged smile twisting his thin lips. "We will send something that doesn't feel pain. Something that doesn't have a soul to be swayed by a silver gaze." Vex led Isolde deep into the bowels of the palace, to the forbidden dungeons where the ancestors had once locked away the hollowed wolves who had lost their minds to the madness of the bloodlust and had been kept alive through dark, alchemical means. They were husks, their skin stretched tight over bone, their eyes milky and void of anything but hunger. They were undead in every way that mattered, fueled by a dark magic that Vex had secretly refined for just such an occasion. With a series of rhythmic strikes against the iron bars, Vex signalled the handlers. The heavy doors groaned open, and the hollow wolves slinked out into the torchlight. They didn't growl. They made a sound like dry leaves skittering over a grave. There were dozens of them, a silent grey army of nightmares that would not stop until they had consumed every living thing in their path. "Go to the northern mist," Vex whispered, his eyes reflecting the dull, dead light of the creatures. "Find the woman. Kill the children. And if the king stands in your way, eat him too." As the pack of horrors vanished into the night, moving with a speed that defied their skeletal frames, Vex looked toward the northern horizon. He had spent his life carving a path to the throne, and he wasn't about to let a 5-year-old ghost take it from him. The sanctuary was about to become a slaughterhouse, and by morning there would be no witnesses left to tell the king the truth. The shadow of the Chancellor was spreading, and it was cold enough to kill the sun as the pack of horrors vanished into the night, moving with a speed that defied their skeletal frames. Vex looked toward the northern horizon. He had spent his life carving a path to the throne, and he wasn't about to let a 5-year-old ghost take it from him. The sanctuary was about to become a slaughterhouse, and by morning there would be no witnesses left to tell the king the truth. The shadow of the Chancellor was spreading, and it was cold enough to kill the sun. The first sign of the invasion wasn't a howl, but a sudden, unnatural silence that swallowed the forest's night song. In the heart of the sanctuary, the air turned frigid, smelling of wet earth and ancient decay. I felt it before I saw it, a jagged, rotting energy that scraped against my skin. Beside me, Daelon stiffened, his golden eyes narrowing as his wolf, Fenris, began to pace with a low, vibrating growl. "Something is wrong," he whispered, his hand going instinctively to the hilt of a borrowed blade. Then they broke through the mist. The hollow wolves were a nightmare made manifest, skeletal shapes moving with a jerky, terrifying speed. They didn't growl. They made a sound like dry bones snapping against stone. Rowan roared a command, and the rogue warriors of the sanctuary surged forward, but the usual tactics meant nothing against creatures that felt no pain. A rogue warrior sank his teeth into a hollow wolf's throat, only for the creature to keep clawing, its milky eyes fixed on the lodge where my children slept. "The nursery!" I screamed, but before I could move, Draven emerged from the shadows of the tree line. He had escaped the mud trap, his face a mask of humiliated rage, holding a spear tipped with pure, jagged silver. He wasn't looking for a fair fight. He was looking for the heart of the resistance. I stepped forward, my hands glowing with a violet light, ready to cast the nullification field that would strip the magic from the monsters. But I was open. Draven saw his moment. With a guttural snarl of traitor, he lunged, the silver spear whistling through the air, aimed directly at my chest. I braced for the impact, but it never came. A wall of muscle and fur slammed into me, knocking me back as Daelon threw himself into the spear's path. The silver blade sank deep into his shoulder, the hiss of burning flesh filling the air as the poison began to sizzle in his royal blood. He let out a strangled roar of agony, but he didn't fall. He stood like a titan between me and the enforcer, his blood steaming as it hit the snow. "Mother!" The cry came from the porch of the lodge. Kieran and Lysandra stood there, their small hands clasped together. The air around them began to vibrate with a frequency that shattered the glass in the windows. Kieran's shadows didn't just crawl, they rose like massive obsidian tidal waves, while Lysandra's hair began to float, glowing with a white lunar fire that turned the night into day. The twins didn't just attack, they harmonized. The shadows and the white fire swirled together, creating a localized hurricane, a silver storm that tore through the clearing. The hollow wolves caught in the vortex didn't just die, they were unmade, the dark magic holding them together evaporated by the twins' divine light. It was a display of power that silenced even the battle, a pulse of pure celestial energy that forced everyone to their knees. In the center of the chaos, Draven stood, trembling. His spear dropped as he stared at the 2 5-year-olds who had just wiped out an army. I stood up, my eyes burning with the violet fire of the High Luna. I didn't need a weapon. I walked toward him, and as I approached, I expanded my aura. "You called me weak," I whispered, my voice echoing with the power of the moon goddess. "You helped him throw me into the grave." I reached out and placed my hand over his heart. I didn't just suppress his wolf. I reached into the core of his being and severed the connection. I pulled the spirit of the beast out of his soul, casting it into the void. Draven let out a high-pitched, pathetic wail as his muscles shriveled and his scent turned from predator to prey. He collapsed into a heap of sobbing, fragile flesh, a human without a soul, a wolfless shell of a man. I turned back to Daelon. He was on his knees, the silver spear still lodged in his shoulder, his face pale as the moon. He looked up at me, not with the pride of a king, but with the awe of a believer. The battle was over, the snow was stained with black and red, and for the first time in 5 years the Nightshade King was bleeding for the family he had tried to destroy. The pulse of the moon was still thrumming in my ears, and I knew that the next time it beat, it would be in the heart of the palace. I turned back to Daelon. He was on his knees, the silver spear still lodged in his shoulder, his face pale as the moon. He looked up at me, not with the pride of a king, but with the awe of a believer. The battle was over, the snow was stained with black and red, and for the first time in 5 years, the Nightshade King was bleeding for the family he had tried to destroy. The pulse of the moon was still thrumming in my ears, and I knew that the next time it beat, it would be in the heart of the palace. We did not return to the Nightshade Palace as supplicants. We returned as a force of nature. Daelon rode at the back, his wound bound but his spirit humbled, while I led the procession through the main gates. Beside me, Rowan and 100 rogue warriors marched with their heads high, their scars no longer marks of shame but badges of survival. But the true power lay in the 2 small figures riding on either side of me. As we entered the city streets, the common wolves stopped in their tracks. The shops emptied, the markets went silent, and a collective gasp rippled through the crowd like a wind through wheat. They didn't see the bastards they had been told to expect. They saw Kieran and Lysandra. When the twins' silver eyes met the gaze of the citizens, the people didn't run, they fell to their knees. They recognized the ancient blood, the divine authority that had been missing from their lives for 5 years, and they wept as the Luna's curse began to lift with every step we took. The throne room doors did not wait for a herald to open them. I blew them off their hinges with a wave of my hand, the wood splintering into 1,000 pieces. Inside, the air was thick with the copper tang of desperate magic. Isolde stood before the throne, her face a frantic mask of terror as she tried to weave a protective barrier from the dark smoke of her rituals. But the magic was turning on her. The shadows she had summoned to kill my children were now coiling around her own throat, sensing that her lies had been exposed. She screamed as her own darkness dragged her into the floorboards, trapping her in a waking nightmare where she would forever be haunted by the voices of those she had tried to destroy. Chancellor Vex stood in the center of the dais, his eyes darting toward the secret exits. But Kieran was faster. With a flick of his small hand, my son sent a wall of solid shadow to block every path. Daelon stepped forward then, his voice returning with a terrifying, absolute clarity. He didn't offer Vex a trial. He offered him justice. "For 5 years you lived in the silence of your lies," Daelon roared. "Now you shall live in the silence of the earth. Vex was dragged down to the pit of silencers, a deep, ancient oubliette beneath the palace where the only sound was the beating of one's own heart. He would spend the rest of his days in a world without a single whisper to keep him company. When the dust settled and the traitors were gone, Daelon turned to me, the heavy gold crown held in his trembling hands. He moved to place it on my head, his eyes pleading for a return to the way things were, but I caught his wrists, my grip firm and unyielding. A path. I am not the Luna you lost, Daelon, I said, my voice carrying to every corner of the crowded hall. And I will never be a shadow behind a throne again. The Nightshade Kingdom will not be ruled by an Alpha King and his consort. From this day forward, the Luna and the Alpha are equal sovereigns. The law of the pack is no longer purity, but compassion. If you cannot accept that, then you may leave the crown on the floor. Daelon looked at me, then at our children, and finally at the rogue warriors who had become my family. He didn't hesitate. He knelt before me, not as a king to a queen, but as a man to his soul. "As you command, High Queen," he whispered. Years later, the Nightshade Kingdom became a legend of its own. The black, withered gardens had been replaced by forests of silver-leafed trees that glowed in the dark. The warriors were strong again, their shifts effortless and filled with light. Daelon and I ruled together, a union forged in fire and tempered by forgiveness. But it was the children who truly led us into the future. I stood on the high balcony of the palace, watching as Kieran and Lysandra practiced their gifts in the courtyard below. As the sun set, the twins turned toward the horizon, their silver eyes glowing with a brilliant, steady light. They looked out over a blooming, healthy world that had once tried to erase them, and I knew that exile hadn't been our end. It had been the beginning of a dynasty that would never know the cold again.